South Bronx tonight, even though we're Zooming and we're not in person. It's really exciting to be here to have a community discussion on the issues facing this city. And let me just say that as part of my job as controller, part of how I know what to audit and how I think about the economy is a lot of this is through the lens of community and these forums. And again, while I wish we could be together, we will have the kind of Q&A that I will let all of us learn about the priorities in the city. Let me say one of the ground rules. There's a lot of people who may have personal issues with a city agency or with issues affecting their family. If we can't answer it tonight, I guarantee you my office will call by 10:30 in the morning, money back guarantee. We will call and follow up with you if you leave your information, if we can't answer a question. For those of you who are on tonight, we're going to try to answer as many questions as possible in the shortest amount of time. And if you have a question, I want you to answer it. If you have a big, long speech, send it to me by email. But I also want to say that in addition to my being able to answer your questions and talk with you, we really have an incredible lineup of wonderful public servants from the Bronx, people I've had an opportunity to work with who really represent the best and the brightest of what government's all about. And I'm really glad that Darcel Clark, our amazing district attorney, is with us. You know, I always want to get the DA on a flyer because that means more people will come. And I'm glad she's here. I know she's busy and can't stay for the whole event, but I'm glad she's here. I want to thank Councilmember Rafael Salamanca, whose expertise on housing and community-based planning is well known to all of you. And I'm glad that he's here as well. I also want to welcome Chantel Jackson, the new Assembly member who's already having an impact in Albany. And I'm really looking forward to working with Assembly Member Jackson. And I know shortly State Senator Alessandra Biaggi will be on, my amazing friend and partner who has done so much for the Bronx and for the city and state. So more elected officials will hop on and we're going to give people the opportunity to hear from them. I'm going to forego opening statements just because of time constraints, but we're going to, when you ask a question, elected officials, feel free to also take a question as well. So with that said, Jessica, let's begin.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of questions coming in. The first one we're going to start with is, what is your position on community land trusts?
Well, let me start by saying this. You know, I proposed the creation of a New York City land bank going back to 2016. And at the time, my office found that the city could use a land bank that would develop 57,000 units of housing on vacant lots that the city already controls. And land banks have been used successfully throughout New York State to acquire this property for affordable housing. In fact, the attorney generals have seeded resources to set up land banks in other cities across the state. We have to do that in New York City by passing legislation. And one of the things that we do at the land bank is we can partner with community land trusts and community-based organizations to build the permanent affordable housing that we need. There's currently 1,000 vacant lots that the city owns. Rather than give those lots to the rich developers in Manhattan, let's give the land to the people through a land bank to community-based organizations. That's how we're gonna build low-income housing, the housing for people who may not make a lot of money, but they're the backbone of our communities. We do not wanna build, in my view, anymore housing that is called affordable, but it's really unaffordable housing. And so we have a plan that we've developed in the controller's office. Be happy to share it with anybody who wants to. I'm really glad for the question. And I can see, does anyone want to follow up? I know that Assembly Member Amanda Septimo, new Assembly member doing big things already, is on.
Okay.
I'm gonna welcome to you. This is our first event together.
Yes.
And I'm really excited that you're here. Do you want to tackle this? Can I give you that question?
Yeah, no, I would love to. I am extraordinarily supportive of community land trust, and I think for exactly the reasons that you just named, there are so many opportunities when we think about brownfield sites, when we think about the 1,000 city-owned lots. There's really opportunity for the city to think about what it means when community is at the front of development. We're seeing an incredible sort of revitalization story happening in Hunts Point, the Spofford jail knocked down, right? And we're going to have these actually affordable apartments going up. And that project was led by the Point CDC, an incredible community based organization. We have another example of this. Model kind of working well with the Diego Beekman houses, who are operating on one of those sort of very long, extensive leases. And community land trusts feel like the final step in this process, right? Like complete the evolution and decide that we're making a permanent investment in community, a permanent investment in making sure that people can stay here for as long as we can imagine, and so that our kids and their kids are not having this fight of affordability in 50 years.
That is very true, and I want to partner with you on these issues. Let me welcome you again, Assembly Member. It is great for you to be on tonight. Let me also recognize, because everyone's coming in and out, but we have another new member of the Assembly who's with us today, and that's Assembly Member Burgos, who I just saw come on. Hello, Assembly Member. You know, we're foregoing opening statements, but you're going to get questions back and forth because we want to get as many as possible. I'm really glad you're on. I'm looking forward to working with you as well. And another longtime member of the City Council who literally needs no introduction to any of us, and that's Council Member Vanessa Gibson, who has joined us as well. So this is a pretty full house for a town hall meeting, and I'm really excited about it. So let's jump in. Jessica, what's our next question?
All right, the next question we have is, okay, here's one on NYCHA. In the last week, New York City had the coldest day of the year and our second major snowstorm. Between the pandemic and the weather, what are you doing to ensure that NYCHA residents have heat and hot water and that building conditions are safe for tenants?
Well, let me remind everybody that there's 400,000 New Yorkers who live in NYCHA developments, and the majority of them, were COVID-19 hotspots. I have held NYCHA accountable and made NYCHA reform a top priority. In fact, I've audited NYCHA developments as controller more than all the controllers combined in modern history. And we have seen lack of transparency and a lack of long-term funding. I called on the city to expedite capital projects that address chronic issues, including poor ventilation, the outages, the broken boilers, mold outbreaks. We have apartments that have more ice on the inside than on the outside. And in June, we conducted an audit that revealed NYCHA's failures to properly track and manage and resolve heating complaints. And we have got to get a system that actually tracks all heating related complaints. One of the things that was heartbreaking for me last winter, and I don't want to see this again, was I was called to a NYCHA building in El Barrio in East Harlem. I went there. Out in the vestibule, I saw a woman who had just gotten out of the hospital because she had a heart attack. I saw another woman with a young child. There hadn't been heat and hot water, and everyone was in the lobby. I called NYCHA and immediately got the heat turned on. But you know what? They turned it on because I was an elected official, citywide elected official. That is now how this system is supposed to work. So we are organizing, we are doing the work, and we are trying to work with NYCHA to make sure that we have a system of repairs and make sure that we keep the heat on. Council Member Vanessa Gibson, would you like to add to this?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Controller. Thank you for having us all together tonight. To all of my colleagues in government and everyone that is watching. It's really critical that we continue to talk about the investments that must be made in NYCHA Unfortunately, New York City housing is one of the largest landlords, but also one of the worst landlords. And we have to really do right by residents in public housing. They have waited far too long for the boilers, the elevator renovations, the capital work. My colleagues and I, we've all put in thousands and thousands of dollars to really make a difference. But the challenge has been the spending of federal and city dollars and really calling the hotline, making sure there's sufficient staff on the ground. Most of our developments in our districts are right now being operated on temporary boilers. And that's why we're having these unfortunate heat and hot water occurrences because of the temporary nature of some of our fixtures. So we will continue to hold them accountable. Certainly now with the new administration, there will be a new Secretary of HUD, and we're hoping that that person will breathe life into HUD so that we can really find a way to invest in NYCHA. There's been a lot of talk around how we can address the $32 billion deficit that NYCHA really has to take care of its entire portfolio. There's been talk around RAD and PACT and the blueprint. And a lot of tenants are very worried. They're worried about efforts to privatize NYCHA, but they're also concerned about their everyday living. And so I think we have to find a balance. We have to find the best plan moving forward. If we don't like the blueprint as tenants, then we need to come up with our own blueprint as elected leaders and as residents of our city. And so I think calling the hotline and making sure you talk to your tenant leaders, the property management, to make sure that we can address the individual issues. But we know on a long-term capacity, we have to do more around expediting a lot of capital work, as you talked about.
Absolutely. By the way, let me welcome, because she has now arrived, someone I work very closely with, who's making a big difference in the state and is no stranger to the Bronx and the city. And she's here tonight, Senator Alessandra Biaggi. Senator, we're not doing opening statements, but we're going to just call on you for questions. Is that okay? And we're nice to have you with us tonight. And we're going to throw this. Kenny Burgos, do you want to weigh in on this?
I do apologize. Could you repeat the question for me quickly? I had to step off for 2 seconds.
No. This is a question on what are we doing with NYCHA and boilers and the challenges the tenants are facing. Vanessa talked a lot about on the ground what we should be doing. I tried to highlight some of the audits that we're doing. What's your take? I know you were like me, starting out a community liaison, so you have been seeing this firsthand before you were elected.
Yeah. Thank you. So, I mean, obviously, I've been working well with a lot of my association, my NYCHA houses in my district. But unfortunately, we've had these issues, right? I have Soundview Houses who has had an external boiler for as long as I can remember at this moment. So I think, you see, D.A. Clark knows very well. She knows very well Soundview Houses. And the boiler's been out there for much too long. And it's a complaint that we get all the time. And I really just think at this point, it's about investment. That there's no other way to put it. The money has to be coming into NYCHA. We need proper investment, not Band-Aid solutions. You know, residents have been living, unfortunately, without respect and dignity for too long, living under these conditions. So I think it's time the city puts in the money into these, into these buildings, into facilities that have just been gone dilapidated for much too long. So money will go a long way into proper equipment.
That's a great answer. Are you just, Assembly Member Jackson or Senator Biaggi, are you hopeful of what the Biden administration brings? We're going to need $45 billion to make this right, which just seems, let me get one of you to address just the stimulus money and how we get there, because so much of this is going to have to come from the federal government.
So thank you for that, Comptroller. Hopeful is all we have at this moment. So I am hopeful. What I will say is that I have at least 20 NYCHA developments in my district. And so I've been even before I was elected, I've been dealing with issues with NYCHA. And so I'm hoping that our new HUD person does exactly what it is that we need. Yes, I hear from our Assemblyman Burgos about investment, but we need to also understand that there's been a lot of misappropriation and we need to look into that. So Comptroller, we're calling on you, in addition to the Biden administration, to look into the amount of money that we're putting into NYCHA and where it's actually going, because it's clearly not going to repairs.
All right, I have now been called out, and all right, I'm on the case. Actually, you and I should collaborate on some of the audits that we've looked at, so maybe I can catch up with you to do that, but thank you. Senator Biaggi, you want to weigh in for a sec?
I think my Assemblywoman my sister Assemblywoman in the Bronx touched on it, but I think that when we're thinking about the Biden administration and housing, especially as it relates to NYCHA, it is no surprise to anybody that we have not only underinvested in NYCHA, but we haven't invested in NYCHA at all. And it's from the small things, like making sure that the locks are replaced, to the very big things, to making sure that there isn't lead in the paint and mold on the walls, and that people are not getting sicker from the housing that they're living in. And so from what I see from this Biden administration, they are leading with compassion and with empathy and from a place of actually caring about human beings. And I think that's the best place to start. And when it comes to the Bronx, there is no place on earth, or at least in this United States, that has been more impacted by COVID-19 and that is more deserving of the care and attention than this very county. So I have a lot of hope. And I think that the federal government is, again, one partner in our way to get there. We, of course, have the city and we have the state. And I think if each of those branches of government or each of those levels of government really step up and swing all the way through, we can deliver and also reduce the suffering for those who live in the Bronx.
Point well made. Jessica, I think we're all ready for the next one.
Okay, we have a few questions that are coming in about the COVID vaccine. So first question on that topic is, do you have a plan to improve the distribution of the vaccine in our community so that it's equitable, since our community was hit hardest by the virus?
Well, let me start. First of all, I could literally spend the rest of the night talking about the vaccine and an equity agenda that will get the virus to communities. Weeks ago, I stood with Public Advocate Jumaane Williams to demand the demographic data to see where the inequitable vaccine distribution laid. 48% of the people who've been vaccinated are white, 15% are Latino and Asian, only 11% are Black. And this is a moral, but a management failure. So I believe we've got to do the following. First, we got to stop vaccinating people who live outside the city. More than a quarter of people vaccinated in New York City don't live here. And when you factor that 25%, then it goes to 60% of those people who happen to be white. So we do not have an equitable plan. I believe that businesses must provide paid time off for employees to get vaccinated. And let me just tell you, we got to fix these 3 websites that keep crashing. I've gotten more young people who call me, people who are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. They're not calling about themselves. They can't navigate the website and answer 50 questions to get their 75-year-old parents and grandparents vaccinated. This is just unbelievable. Now, last point I want to make is, we didn't know the virus was here. So I understand that the ramp up on the testing would take time. It was new. We didn't actually know how to do it. But when that virus came here, the one thing we knew in any medical journal was the vaccine was being worked on. And every month it was getting better and better. Today we have J&J and another 60 million doses. I mean, it's coming, but we don't have a platform to get our people inoculated. And we could have planned for this. And that is the outrage. And I believe that we've got to, as elected officials, we got to make sure that everybody is inoculated with a community-based plan. Anyone want to weigh in?
I'm happy to
Actually, I actually would like to weigh in on this, believe it or not, the DA. But you know what? You're right. The Bronx has been the hardest hit. We have the worst numbers in the city, and we have a borough that is full of Black and brown people. Those very numbers that you're saying are underrepresented. That is not good enough, okay? We have to get the supply, but at the same time, we as elected officials, we as Bronx residents need to speak to our neighbors and let them know how important it is that they do get the vaccination. So we got a two-pronged problem. We need to have a plan to roll it out, but let's say we had the perfect plan. We got to convince ourselves that it's important enough to take that vaccine. I work in the court system. We had a backlog of cases, victims that are not having their cases heard and not being paid attention to. You have defendants that are in Rikers Island or people waiting for their cases to happen. And the courts are trying to reopen, but we can't, because one of the hot spots right now in the Bronx, the courthouse, coronavirus in the courthouse. And as we try to bring in jurors for the grand jury so we can continue the process, the virus is coming in. And you know why? It's the people from the Bronx who are bringing it in, because we have the highest numbers. We have to have protection for our people. All of us on this call are from the Bronx, are credible messengers to your constituents, to your neighbors, to say, look, we got to do this. Now, if I could get the vaccine myself and stand there and tell them not be afraid to do it, I would. I'm not in a category yet, but I think that we need, in order to get the people vaccinated that we need vaccinated, some of this, you got to wait till you're 75 or this or that. Yankee Stadium on Friday is opening up. 15,000 vaccinations available. If 15,000 Bronxites want that so that we can get the herd immunity that we need, then we should do away with all these categories and put the vaccination in the arms of Bronxites that really want it, and more importantly, that need it, so that we can bring these coronavirus numbers down in our community. I feel very strongly about this. I think that they should offer it to grand jurors. So look, if you do your civic duty, we'll make sure that you get a vaccination. That's what we need to do. But we need to get our economy back. We need to get the courts back. We need to get our communities healthy again.
Look, you made very, very good points, and thank you. By the way, this is the place to be tonight. This is the Controller Town Hall meeting in the South Bronx. And guess who joined? Our Councilwoman, Diana Ayala. Diana, it's great to see you. We're foregoing opening statements, but I'm just going to call on people. If you raise your hand, you want to say something, we're just going to keep this moving. But I'm so glad that you're here tonight. Jessica, give us another one.
Okay, coming right up. The next question I have is, let me just grab one. Okay, this question is on crime. The crime rate is steadily rising over the course of the last year. What approach would you take to combat this surge and address the issue moving forward?
Well, before I give anyone a chance on that, Madam District Attorney, this seems like your first call.
I will hope that I know a little bit of something about this. No, the rise in crime is real. I mean, it is no joke. I've been the DA for the last 5 years now, and we were doing very well until COVID hit. And once, people started coming back outside or whatever, I don't know. I think it's just a perfect storm between people losing their jobs, people losing important family members in their lives, people being ill, people having beefs, and the crime has gone up. The question is, what can we do about it to bring it down and to make our communities safe? It is so important that we do this. That's why throughout the pandemic, I was still out there going out to our neighborhoods and communities and asking those questions. What is it that we can do to get people to put these guns down and to appreciate each other's lives? And many of you here on this call were my partners in it. Councilmember Vanessa Gibson was there side by side with me on a lot of them. Chantel Jackson was there. Ralph, you were there. We've gone to rallies at the spot where people have been killed. And the thing is that I decided to do is, the data doesn't lie. People need to know what the data is. I have the crime statistics. I know what's happening in the communities. I know the hot spots. What I did was identify those hot spots and bring that data to the stakeholders in those communities and saying, this is what is happening in your community. You tell me what it is that you need to help make your community safe. Because I could come up with all kinds of policies and speak to the police department and make them rush in and do all kinds of things, but that doesn't work. You need to buy in from the people who actually live there. And as we started having these very tough conversations with people, we were able to find out what they needed. They wanted resource fairs. They need jobs. They need affordable housing. They wanted marches to go right into the neighborhoods where these gangs and crews are happening. And I've done that. And I've spoken to these gang members because I want to tell them, I don't want to continue to see them die. You know, we lost Brandon Hendricks, a young, promising St. John's University basketball player. We've lost so many people whose names that people are not even familiar with. So I speaking directly to those members. Put that gun down. You tell me, DA Clark, do this and I will put this gun down. And that's what I wanted to do. So as they told me what resources they needed, I went into those communities and tried to bring it. One thing that I knew was important was to have a gun buyback. And, you know, we've had those for years throughout the city, and I held them in the past, but this year had to be different because the violence was different. Okay. So what I did was again, partnered with NYPD. We gave out the $200 gift cards, but I knew we needed more of an incentive. People needed more. They need groceries. They need money. You know, they need food. So when I did my gun buyback this time, we had it in a local church. The church gave away free food because we've had so many food distributions and you've all worked on that. But I said, we need to do more. And I went out and got donations of iPads because we got so many kids in our community that are not connected, that can't get the education they need to do virtual work. We got people out of work. Those parents, their caregivers, need to get online to find jobs and things like that. So I got iPads, a donation of 75, and then thank God we have the New York Yankees. They matched it 150 iPads. When that gun buyback was over, we removed 136 guns off of the Bronx streets. And that's what's important. So that's what we need to do. Engage the community, the clergy, the community, everyone. Let us come up with the solutions on how we save our community.
Well, I got to tell you something. We just heard from the district attorney who talked about how we prevent people being with her in the courthouse. And I think that's very powerful because that is not, you know, what we expect to hear, but we have somebody who understands the job is to keep people, kids away from the criminal justice system. Let me ask Councilmember Salamanca, you know, one of the things that does really work, pivoting to what the DA said, is this notion of mentors in communities talking to the kids, right? Respected people in communities who can relate to the kids. Do you feel that has to be ramped up because these programs are actually not in every community?
Absolutely. I mean, look, we have many programs in my communities and Diana and Vanessa, such as Guns Down, Life Up. You know, when there are some type of shootings or violence, they're quick to respond to ensure that there's no retaliation. But I think what I saw during COVID in terms of the violence increasing, a lot had to do with the city being shut down. There not being any after school programs, schools shut down. Kids, adolescents had nothing to do. They were just hanging out in the corner. It got to a point that the mayor's he put padlocks on playgrounds and parks, so there was nothing to do. And I think that as the state and the city, as we're moving into the new year, is the power of the budget. I know that the state is going to pass a budget in April. The city is going to pass a budget in June. Collectively, we need to work together to ensure that we're adding more dollars to programs so that kids have something to do after school. And also we incentivize individuals, bringing in more programs so that there's more job creations, so that individuals in our communities have something to do. Violence is going to continue to increase if you have nothing to do. And we as elected officials have to step up and use the power of the budget to do that.
All right. Jessica.
Okay, we have more questions coming in on the vaccine. So I'm going to see if you or others want to weigh in on this again. The next question is about regaining the trust of Black and Brown communities regarding the vaccine, since the trust has been broken as a result of unethical medical practices.
All right, well, we heard from the DA about this. What about on the most local community level? And, you know, Diana, you want to start with it?
You can't get any more local than the fact that my own mother won't get the damn vaccine. And the reason that she won't get it is because of the misinformation, right, that is consistently shared via the news, right? She's listening to stories and she's like, did you hear that somebody died? Did you hear that somebody had an allergic reaction? Did you hear? And I'm constantly like demystifying, and this is happening in my own home, right? And so we need to do a better job of educating, communities of color. I think that there's a lot of distrust. There was a lot of distrust in the Trump administration, and people feel like this was ramped up too quickly, and they feel like they've been sacrificed and been the guinea pigs, right, for generations, and they don't want to do that. Somebody told me, are you the first one to buy the first iPhone? No, I'm not buying the first iPhone. So I'm gonna wait it out, and I don't think that that is the safest way to go. But I think that we haven't done our due diligence in really, going out to the local communities and educating them on the benefits of this. And what I tell my mother is, there are side effects to everything, right? There's going to be a side effect to the vaccine, but there are also side effects to COVID. You have to weigh your options. And so it's really critical that people educate themselves on the pros and cons. If you have the flu vaccine and you're allergic to eggs, you're going to have a reaction. It's very unlikely. Out of the hundreds of thousands of people that have been vaccinated, there aren't that many cases of, where people have gotten seriously ill. It doesn't mean that it won't happen. I think it happens, right? But it's important that you do that by doing it in the hospital and vaccinating in spaces with, health professionals, and they're there to really help take care and address whatever issues may arise. But I definitely think that we need to do a better job of educating the community.
I wonder if maybe we can all partner in a more robust way in really designing like community-based programming to get people to understand this. One of the recommendations my office put forward was, look, we have thousands of contact tracers that aren't doing contact tracing work. And what happens if we would just redirect the program to basically be vaccine educators in our community? One of the things I want to scream from the rooftops is when you look at the Pfizer drug and the Moderna drug, and the J&J drug, the vaccination that just came out, basically in their trials, nobody dies. It's one shot and nobody dies. And that vaccine will be here shortly. And I think that we need to get people ready, because at some point, I'm actually looking at the glass half full. I think when we get the vaccine protocols moving, we could see a glut on the market and nobody's taking it. And that would be, it would be unbelievable if you can't get your mother to take it, right? What a dangerous situation that would be. Anybody else on the vaccine?
Can I jump in real quick, Comptroller?
Yeah, sure. And then
okay.
Yeah.
So what I will say is that we have done a terrible job at messaging this vaccine, and how we are approaching it is not helpful. So I know like some of the things we're saying is like, oh, you must get it, you have to get it, without listening to why people are choosing not to get it. And so on a very local level, yes, we have to continue to have conversation and education, but we have to listen. We have to really, truly listen to what people are saying about the vaccination before we jump in and say, you got to get it. We got to save people. What people are hearing constantly is that like, you're pressuring me to do something that I don't trust. And instead of building the trust, we're just like pumping out the idea that they must do this thing. And so I think it's really extremely important for us to not be talking to people, but actually listening to people. And so we have to change how we're messaging it so that when we do give the information, people are more receptive to hearing it. And the messaging has been terrible from the top on down about how we get communities of color to actually trust the vaccine enough to actually take it. My mom is another one, Diana, that will not take the vaccine. Yeah. And she's up to get it. Wow. So we must listen to people.
Huh.
Great. If I could just add very quickly, Comptroller, yeah. I agree. And I think, there is some deep-rooted issues in communities of color when you talk about vaccine, when you talk about experimentation. And so I think it's important to recognize that we have to have people talking to us that look like us. I hosted a Zoom call yesterday with the Department of Health and Health in Hospitals with 2 African-American physicians that were talking about a lot of the concerns, a lot of the hesitancies and anxieties that people of color feel. Because for older adults with underlying health conditions, there is a history that is a painful one, and they are very nervous, even if it means saving their lives. they are nervous, and that's a risk that many don't want to take. My mom is older with underlying health conditions, and I struggle with her because we're trying to tell people that it's the best way to go, but it's also about the deep-rooted history that we have to acknowledge and talk about. And I also think it's important that for those of us that have a primary care doctor, we have to talk to our doctors. We have to listen to science. So many of our families don't have access to primary care. They don't have a primary care doctor. They're not getting that continuity of care. So we have to talk to folks on the ground, the FQHCs, the healthcare centers, the clinics, H&H, Gotham, all the folks that have been in our communities, and really making sure that we can develop long-term plans so that people do have a primary care doctor. So when and if things like this come up, they have someone that they can go to. That's the challenge. We're all the doctors for parents and older residents, and we don't know the science. So I think it's important when we have these conversations with our medical facilities and our healthcare professionals, it's really important to make sure language access is important and respected, as well as making sure that folks that look like us are talking to us.
Well, I got to tell you something. If you look at this webinar tonight, we have 2 members of the city council and an assemblywoman who have 3 mothers who are not taking the vaccine, and look at their daughters, right, and positions that they're in. That says that this is much deeper. Jessica, let's go to another question, please.
Absolutely. The next question we have is on internet access. The question is, given the slow rollout of the Internet Master Plan and associated funding, what can the city do to better coordinate and speed up progress towards universal broadband for Bronx sites?
Well, I'm going to briefly just kick this off. We got 100,000 kids in homeless shelters, and it is staggering that 100,000 kids, many of them do not have internet access, and many of them don't have remote learning devices. We're talking about like 40,000 households. And the reality is that the Department of Education is not going door to door and making sure kids have devices. And the fact that the DA has to hand out iPads, the fact that what has become a learning instrument is not readily available is absolutely discrimination. And the kids who don't have access to the internet or to iPads basically are the kids that were already behind because of the inequality in the system. They're going to be falling behind. And the other thing, on top of the internet access, and I do think this is related, kids are going to struggle with coming to terms with the loss of their parents who were nurses and frontline workers who died. A lot of these kids have not even had the closure. My kid's mother, grandma died. They haven't had closure. And that has to be addressed as well. One of the things that we believe is I think that we should immediately create a passport program so that low-income families can get automatic internet access. We give these cable companies franchises. This is an absolute education and medical emergency as far as I'm concerned, and we have got to provide that internet access. It's actually not that expensive to subsidize it because it's now become a learning tool. Just like when a kid walks into a classroom and that kid gets a book, families don't pay for the books. That's part of the education system. Who wants to weigh in?
If I could weigh in, that would be great.
Please, Senator.
Comptroller, I think everything that you said is right on the money, and I want to just talk about it from the state perspective and also just from what it's been like to represent the district that I do in this moment, and to also not have answers, which is just insufficient and it doesn't work. And so, recently we heard from our governor about the state of the state that 98% of the state has access to broadband. That's simply not true. And I want to just be very clear about that. And I'm not telling you that because I don't want it to be true. In fact, I want it to be true, and that's the whole point. So what does that mean? It means we have to invest in infrastructure across the entire state, but especially in places like the Bronx and the South Bronx, where to this day still, there are children who are doing remote learning on their parents' cell phones. During the fall, leading into the winter, we did a lot of work with the Hunts Point Alliance for Children. And the fact that there were still families almost 9 months into remote learning who not only didn't have a device, but they didn't even have an answer. And why didn't they have an answer? Because if their principals or the superintendents were really calling on the city to provide those devices, they weren't getting answers. And so I took it upon myself to do that outreach and to make a call for help to the chancellor. What we learned was that not only were we unable to figure out where we were in the queue, but the Bronx was not prioritized. The Bronx was not prioritized when it came to tablets. The Bronx was not prioritized when it came to internet access. And to this day still, we are February 3rd, 2021, and there are still families in the South Bronx who do not have tablets to allow for their children to learn. And so what does that mean? It means that when we don't have answers because our government refuses to be transparent and refuses to share that information, it means that we cannot do our jobs. And so one of the most important things is not only a commitment with funds to make sure that we actually provide all of these devices and services, but that we make Wi-Fi and internet free, because it should be a public utility that everybody can have access to. It should not be a privilege. And to the point that the comptroller made about homeless shelters, I mean, I represent a very large district, and there are so many children who live in homeless shelters. And if you go across the district, in the Mount Vernon portion of my district, which I know is not the Bronx, but it just to pinpoint how big this issue is, there's 100,000 people who live in Mount Vernon. 1,000 children are homeless. So that number is only magnified by all of the issues that we're facing. And in the Bronx, it is the same. And so to not have internet access in 2021, in the greatest city in the world, and to not have our leaders, especially those who are responsible and charged with with providing these services, including our chancellor, have their hair on fire about it, is absolutely unacceptable. And I want to just send one final signal. It doesn't mean that the people in the Bronx don't deserve it. In fact, you deserve it more than almost any other place on earth. It means that some of the people in positions of power don't care, but we care. And that's why we're here, and I care. And I am not going to stop until I get those answers. And I know I'm not alone with this Bronx delegation here who also feels the same way. So we are going to continue to fight for this because it matters. But again, 2021, we should not have this problem in the greatest city in the world.
Totally. No,
Can I just add?
Councilman Salamanca, please.
I just want to say how much I agree with my state senator Biaggi and yourself on this issue. Look, the digital divide in the Bronx is real, you know, and I agree with Senator Biaggi. We should have free universal internet across the board. A few states ago, my colleagues and I in the city council, we passed a law which opened up the franchise agreements for the city. You know, currently right now, there's only 3 internet providers. Optimum, which is Altice, Verizon, and I'm missing the I think it's Time Warner. Those are the only 3. For decades, this was happening. So just recently in the city council, we gave DeWitt the authority to open up the franchise agreement so that we can take away that monopoly that these 3 companies have and allow other companies to come in and bid where they can have more competitive prices. And then finally, in terms of homeless shelters, every homeless shelter provider should provide free internet to each and every one of their clients. About 2 months ago, I was with Assemblywoman Chantel Jackson, where there was a family where they did not have access to, they didn't have a computer. Luckily, we got some computers donated. We were able to provide it to them. But what was worse is that Optimum was not providing adequate Wi-Fi to that building. And it took Chantel and I to get on the phone and visit that homeless shelter to address the issue. And that's really unacceptable.
And, you know, I want to tell you something. You know, as many of you know, I have 2 little kids in public school. I got a 3rd grader and a 2nd grader. And I'm the first to admit that I am a failed remote learning teacher. This is very tough. One of my kids I put back into school because he was struggling. Another child, you know, I got, you know, my wife's working, I'm working, and there was a period where we started to feel sorry for ourselves. And then I had this moment when I realized how privileged I am, because when the internet went out in my house, and here I am serving as controller, my wife works at a museum, you know what we did? We got online and we boosted the internet service. You can do that if you have money. When the iPad broke in the house, I took out a credit card and I just bought an iPad. That seemed easy for someone privileged, but most people are not privileged. Most people can't put $500 on a credit card. Most people can't boost the internet for $30. And it's so outrageous because kids are being advantaged based on the wealth of their parents. And look, people are going to beg, borrow, and steal to do everything they can for their kids. But what a disadvantage. And Councilman, I agree with you that these franchise agreements, we got to put the pressure on. And Senator Biaggi's right. This is unacceptable for this in the Bronx. I'm going to try to move us now, but I think this is important for us to work on together. Jessica, do you want to?
Yep, I got another question here. What efforts have you made and will you make to see that traditionally marginalized communities are represented in high-ranking positions within city government, as well as creating pipelines for young adults to gain knowledge about working in city government?
Maybe I'll kick it. I think that was directed at me. Let me give you one example, and I think it's very important. You know, we have to make sure that people in city government reflect the diversity of the city. You know, as controller, I started something nationally called the Boardroom Accountability Project. The companies that we invested in the pension fund, I mean, most of these companies were run by male, pale, and stale guys, and it reflected on the company in a bad way because diversity at the highest levels of government and corporate America yield better results. We would never have had Enron and WorldCom and the financial collapse in 2008 if there were more people of color on the boards. And that's because people have different life perspective. And so part of what I think we have to do in city government is the mayor has to have a chief diversity officer, like we appointed in the controller's office. We need a chief diversity in every city agency because we have got to use the power of procurement. We spend $23 billion on hiring lawyers and accountants, and we hire food vendors, and only 5% of those contracts go to people of color. So how are you going to build wealth in a community when we don't have that kind of investment? We do something in our office called MWBE University, not to be confused with Trump University. And we bring businesses headed by a person of color or a woman into meeting with corporations. And there was this young woman, African-American woman, raises her hand and says, "Controller, I'm a publicist. I know I'm young, but I have a contract with Nike." She said, "It's not easy for a young person like me to have a contract with Nike." And you know, the truth is, it's not, right? Usually they hire the big firms, and she got that contract. She said, "I work for Nike and I can't get a contract at the Department of Education. They won't return my calls at the Department of Transportation." And the reason we need to diversify the highest levels of these agencies is because we need to put people in these agencies who reflect the diversity of the city so that we have mentorship. I found in corporate America during my time as controller that these corporations, you get a young woman of color and she went to the best schools, the best universities. She comes into the corporation and she gets in the elevator and she's on her way to the C-suite, right? That elevator is cruising, and then all of a sudden that elevator stops and she never quite gets off to the C-suite and never the corporate board. That's the same as what's happening in government. We don't have a mentorship program for women and people of color to get in. In fact, I would argue, I know many of you on this call tonight, nobody took any of you and said, "You're going to be elected officials." You had to fight your way into government. And there has to be a recognition that diversity strengthens government. And I've seen this firsthand. And I think this is a great question to hold all of us accountable. And by the way, especially people who look like me, you know, you got to be held accountable. You can't just keep talking about it. You actually have to, show the way. And I hope we can all do that. Who wants to jump in?
I'd love to jump in here.
I know you were waiting for this. Go ahead.
I mean, you know, I'm big on accountability. And I think the reality is that we live in this world where we're comfortable diagnosing issues, but for whatever reason are not as comfortable with accountability. We have to get to a world where we understand that we can't be talking about the digital divide 5 years from now. We can't continue to talk about Section 3 requirements, about MWBEs, about how we want to give them more funding, and not actually get to a place where they're funded. And that means giving teeth to some of our policies, right? So when we talk about goals of Section 3 and making sure that MWBE funding happens, well, what happens when you pick up a contractor and they don't meet their Section 3 requirements and they're not using MWBEs? How do we claw back some of those incentives that we so freely give out? And then when we think about the digital divide, we've known about the digital divide for many years. When we hear about all of the inequities with the vaccine, we could have anticipated a lot of these things, right? Even as we speak in this moment, the city's vaccination portal, you need a distinct email address to sign up. How many people have an email address? I had to make 6 different appointments for people in my family. Luckily, I had 6 email accounts, but at some point you run out, right? And that's a small detail that if we had thought about this as a community, someone could have said, hey, maybe a phone number, maybe a distinct phone number would have been enough. And so when you look at these rooms and you look at our community not being included at every step of the way, it's clear where the policy breakdowns happen and why they happen. And so I'm so happy to hear you say the word accountability, because I think accountability means so much more than just speaking in these spaces and diagnosing problems and saying that we've got to do more. It also means being prospective about these issues and having communities that are at the front line of impact, being at the front line of policy making, so that we're not constantly spinning in these circles where we're learning hard lessons that we already know exist and then having to constantly rehash and recalibrate instead of starting the right way, because we're starting with the people who are most impacted.
Smart. Who else? We're gonna give the Assemblywoman the last word. Okay. All right.
Okay. I'll go to another question. What would you do to help small businesses rebound? Particularly, how would you help Bronx small businesses that did not receive their fair share of PPP funding in round 1?
All right, well, I'm not going to start this. So let's go to Bronx first.
I'm happy to start with this one. I would love to, actually. So I think that one of the things, this is probably the best way to end this town hall, because it ties together so many of the themes that we're talking about. It ties together language access, which unfortunately we don't have it consistently across the board, especially at the state level when we're talking about communications. I think probably everybody on here, except the exception of my fellow colleagues in state government, would be surprised that the state doesn't really have translation services for the legislature, which is crazy because we all collectively represent so many beautifully diverse neighborhoods and communities and populations. But if we can't communicate with those communities or people, we can't get the information out there. And that's a key part of how we can make sure that everybody has access to the resources. So that's number 1. Number 2, we've got to really think creatively. I know that that's not something that we talk about in government a lot, but we've got to do it. We've got to think creatively about how we can use the technologies that exist, but also fill the gaps in the places that don't have technology to make sure the information lands. So what does that mean? It means maybe we have to make sure that every single 19.5 million New Yorker has a way to get in touch with their government. Maybe it means for those who don't have internet access or Wi-Fi or a device to be able to communicate with them through the mail. But we've got to make sure that we actually have the right data, the right information, that we are making the earnest attempt to deal with this. One of the things that I saw when it came to small businesses, especially in the undocumented community, is that they were afraid. They were afraid, and they continue to be afraid to ask for the vaccine, afraid to be tested, afraid to apply for any kind of resource. And by the way, just to be very clear, we haven't made resources available for a large number of undocumented people in the Bronx, but across the entire state. And so the fact that we remain here where so many businesses have had to close, many of whom have had to close because they cannot get access to the PPP loans, means that we've failed. And it's okay to fail if you are willing to accept it, to acknowledge it, and to be able to create a plan where you do not fail again because you don't make the same mistake twice. Unfortunately, this is a similar mistake to things we've done in the past. And so when we look forward, it means we're going to have to get better at being in touch with our small businesses and investing in the ways that will make sure that our communication is ironclad. And last thing I'll say, if we have to lace up our sneakers and walk the streets and knock on every single door and canvas and have the old-fashioned canvassing, which we know works probably better than all the things I've just mentioned, then so be it. But this is also the power of organizing, and why we also, as elected officials and leaders in the community, I think, care so much about engaging and galvanizing the people that we represent, because we cannot do it alone. But together we can make sure that everyone is taken care of.
But you know, I have to say that you're right about being more proactive with our small businesses. We've lost 2,800 small businesses since the pandemic that employed 500,000 people. But I'll tell you something that's really scary pre-pandemic. My office did a study that showed that in 10 years, from 2007 to 2017, we went from 5 million square feet of vacant retail space to 10 million square feet. And with the pandemic now, Senator, we're at 17 million square feet of vacant retail space. You go down corridors in the Bronx, there's no stores. Upper West Side, no stores. Queens, no stores. And the businesses are barely hanging on. The PPP money, only 12% of that money went to the small businesses. All the corporations made mint. They got all the funding they needed. And now there's a second round coming, and we got to get the word out. And, you know, we've got to get boots on the ground going door to door. So I agree with you on PPP. The other thing we got to do is what's keeping businesses alive is this whole notion of the online tech platform. And you know that immigrant businesses or businesses where people have language barriers do not have the same resources to set up those platforms. So the city agency should be going out and saying, Mr. or Ms. Businesswoman, here, we got the tools to help you get that extra 20% revenue that's going to help you get through that crisis. We've got to do this for the businesses. And lastly, we got to stop putting folks out of business. We need tax credits. And we got to incentivize moving new businesses into these vacant, hollowed out corridors, because nobody really wants to be the first business on the block. And believe it or not, that's what we have. We do have PPP money coming in. We're going to have to use stimulus money to help offset some of these costs. But I will just say that the road back for the economy is not through Wall Street. They're going to be fine. I can tell you as controller, they're doing great. Trump gave them everything they needed. The question is, what do we do with these businesses? Because if they fall, then the city falls. And that's something we all have to work on together. And that's our women and minority-owned businesses right there. Anybody else want to step in? And
Yes, really quickly. So, you know, I was able to partner with Amanda Septimo in our 3rd Avenue bid, even though it's right outside of my district. It's really in Amanda's district. And we had a forum where we talked about how to apply for PPP. And this is what's absolutely necessary. When you talk about boots on the ground, I know I've only been in this position only a month, but I have my team actually going out block by block to find out what businesses are currently there. So they have my contact information and I have theirs, but also what businesses we lost. And we're going block by block for every block in my district to make sure that we can support them. I'm also grateful to say that I get to sit on the small business committee in Albany. And so trust me that we will be working on legislation to make sure that we have the tools necessary for small businesses to exist. I would not be here in this position if it wasn't for small businesses, with my mom being one who operated small business and my dad businesses. So for our families. And so trust and believe that the work we have to do has to be on the ground level moving forward.
Totally. So look, you know, ladies and gentlemen, every elected official tonight came on and said to me, look, I got a lot of meetings in my district on Zoom, so I can only stay for a few minutes. And every elected official stayed for the whole town hall meeting. And that really shows their commitment to answering questions that we just threw at them. And I just really want to thank DA Clark, Councilmember Salamanca, Senator Biaggi, Assemblymember Burgos, Assemblymember Septimo, Assemblymember Jackson, Councilmember Gibson, Councilmember Diana Ayala. I want to really thank all of you for being here tonight. You made this town hall meeting what it is. Let me just say to everybody who didn't get to answer a question, if you have, again, an issue that's personal, if there's an issue you have with housing or education, an issue with your children, if you're a senior out there who needs help, if you leave the information in the chat tonight, my office will call you back no later than 10:30. That's like a money back guarantee. And then what we'll do is we'll match your question with one of the elected officials, and we'll partner to make sure we can resolve your personal complaints. And if you have larger issues you want to discuss with any of the elected officials, if you leave your information and you say, I want to talk to Gibson, I got to get to Septima, whatever you got to do, then just leave it and I'll refer it. And again, I want to thank everybody in our South Bronx Town Hall meeting. Hundreds of people participated tonight, and a whole lot of folks, I think, got a lot out of it. And again, elected officials, I want to thank you. Look, we're going to bring this city back better than ever, and we're going to double down in the Bronx. And the one thing I know is a kid who grew up in Washington Heights, whose family has long lived in the Bronx, my stepfather, Carlos Cuevas, who served as the deputy borough president of Bronx a generation ago. This is a borough that never, ever lets its guard down, and it will come back bigger than ever. So thank you all for being here tonight, and we'll see each other soon. Be safe. Thank you, electeds. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bronx.
Thank you, Mr. Controller.